Here's what nobody tells you when you're first starting out. The most productive people you know aren't operating on motivation. They're operating on something far more reliable and far less glamorous. Think about it. If motivation were the engine of achievement, why do Olympic athletes train on days they'd rather stay in bed? Why do researchers continue experiments after the 100th failure? Why does anyone show up to difficult work when the initial excitement has long since evaporated? The answer reveals a critical misunderstanding we've all internalized. We've confused the feeling of wanting to do something with the capacity to do it anyway. It's the difference between building a life on solid ground versus building it on quicksand. Let me actually walk you through what's happening in your brain when you experience motivation. When you watch that inspiring video or read that transformative quote, you're experiencing a dopamine surge, a neurochemical reward that feels like clarity and purpose. Psychologists have documented what they call the intention-behavior gap, the space between actually feeling motivated to change and actually implementing the change. Research shows that this gap is vast and for a good reason. Your brain is responding to the idea of achievement, but not achievement itself. It's giving you the reward before you've actually done the work. And here's the critical part. That same dopamine hit is supposed to come from actual progress, from concrete action. When you get it prematurely on inspiration alone, you've essentially hacked the reward system without earning it. This is why motivation feels so unreliable, because it's a neurochemical fluctuation, not a stable resource. Expecting consistent motivation is like expecting consistent adrenaline. It's a response mechanism, not a baseline state. Your emotional state is governed by dozens of variables: sleep quality, blood sugar, stress hormones, recent social interactions, and even the weather. Now, here's where it gets interesting and counterintuitive. The behavioral psychology research is unambiguous on this point. Action precedes motivation far more reliably than motivation precedes action. This isn't inspirational rhetoric. It's observable neuroscience. When you initiate a task, any task, your brain begins a prediction process. It starts modeling the reward pathway, anticipating completion, generating that neurochemical environment that supports continued effort. This is why the hardest part of writing is the blank page, why the hardest part of exercise is putting on your shoes, why the hardest part of any difficult conversation is the first word. The activation energy required to begin is high precisely because your brain hasn't yet committed resources to the task. But once you cross that threshold, once you're in motion, the neurochemical infrastructure shifts to support continuation. Think about it in terms of physics. An object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion. Your brain operates on similar patterns. The state change from stillness to movement requires energy, and maintaining movement requires far less. This is the mechanism behind what people misidentify as getting in the zone or finding your flow. They didn't actually find anything. They created it by the simple act of beginning. If you study the biographies of historically productive individuals, you'll notice that few of them describe waiting for motivation. The Stoic philosophers understood this implicitly. When Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, he wasn't describing the ideal state he achieved. He was reminding himself daily of the principles he needed to practice regardless if he felt like it. This pattern is consistent across domains. Discipline precedes excellence, systems precede success, and action precedes feeling. Now, this isn't to romanticize suffering or to glorify difficulty for its own sake. It's simply recognizing that people who've produced meaningful work didn't have access to some special reserve of motivation that you lack. They had the same fluctuating emotions, the same resistance, the same doubts. What they developed was a different relationship to those feelings. One where feelings were acknowledged, but not granted veto power. So how do we operationalize this understanding? How do we translate these principles into actual behavior change? First, you have to reframe your relationship with resistance. When you feel resistance to starting something important, it's not evidence that it isn't the right task or the right time. It's simply just your brain doing what it does, attempting to conserve energy and avoid uncertainty. Recognize it as a neutral psychological response, not a meaningful message. The second step is that you need to engineer your environment with minimal friction. Every obstacle between you and your starting point is an opportunity for your emotional state to sabotage your intentions. Want to exercise in the morning? Sleep in your workout clothes. Want to write daily? Then open the document the night before. Want to eat better? Make bad options require more steps than good ones. You're not fighting willpower. You're reducing the number of micro decisions that willpower has to win. Your third step is to weaponize the 2-minute rule, understood properly. The principle isn't only to commit 2 minutes. It's making starting so easy that your emotional state becomes irrelevant. 2 minutes of work isn't the goal. It's the engine that generates momentum that carries you through the next hour. You're not trying to accomplish something in 2 minutes. You're trying to change the neurochemical state from rest to motion. Your fourth step is that you need to track behaviors, not outcomes. Outcomes are subject to variables that you don't control. Behaviors are binary. Either you did them or you didn't. Did you write for 30 minutes? Yes or no? Did you send the difficult email? Yes or no? This removes ambiguity and removes your emotional interpretation of whether you're doing well. Instead, you're either honoring your systems or you're not. And your fifth and final step is accepting inconsistency as part of the pattern, not evidence of failure. You will miss days. You will have periods of lower output. This doesn't invalidate your system. It makes you human. The question isn't, how do I not miss? It's, how quickly do you return? Resilience isn't perfection, it's recovery speed. Here's what I want you to consider. What would your life look like if you stopped waiting for readiness? Not in some distant future where you've somehow accumulated enough motivation to begin, but right now, today, this hour. What if the gap between who you are and who you want to become isn't a matter of waiting for the right feeling, but simply the accumulated difference of the days you act and the days you didn't? Because here's the truth that took me years to internalize. The version of yourself that you're trying to become doesn't feel fundamentally different than who you are right now. They're not more motivated. They're not operating on some elevated emotional plane that you haven't reached yet. They simply just stopped negotiating with their resistance. They stopped treating their emotional state as some arbiter of their actions. They built systems that function regardless of how they feel. And that's not inspiration, that's engineering. So the question isn't, how do I become the kind of person who feels like doing hard things? The question is, how do I become the kind of person who does the hard things anyway? Because motivation doesn't create action. Action creates motivation. And that reversal, that simple inversion of that casual chain you've been taught your entire life, that's where everything changes. Not when you feel ready, but when you begin.